Have you ever wondered what it would be like if Chivalry was a roguelike dungeon crawler and all of the other players saying mean things to you in chat were replaced by blue NPCs who you can dismember to your heart's content? Well, that's the kind of experience you'll find in Mortal Sin, an early access title impressively created by a single person. Its core gameplay loop is incredibly addicting, primarily due to the game having some of the tightest melee-centric combat that I've experienced in a long time. My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Mortal Sin. Mortal Sin features your typical roguelike gameplay loop of dying repeatedly until you're strong, competent, or lucky enough to get the perfect run that gets you to the end of the game. Levels are all randomly generated, and you'll need to find and step on several floor buttons before being able to progress to the next floor, all while slashing through hordes of demons and avoiding traps. You'll be doing this in 3 distinct zones: a dungeon, a cave, and a forest. Each zone has 5 levels, and a boss or multiple bosses await you at the 5th level. Once the zone is completed, you'll be sent back to the main hub area for a quick breather before you jump into the next one. I'll admit, I found myself struggling to even get through the first few levels when I started out, as I was still getting accustomed to the layout of each zone and the game's intricate combat, which we'll touch on more later. I was constantly running into traps and getting slapped by enemies that seemed like they came out of nowhere. But I steadily grew more confident over time after countless runs and many deaths. One thing that does feel really good about the game is that it feels like there's a serious sense of mastery you obtain when you're able to cruise through levels and perfectly parry enemy attacks. Once you get to that point, runs will feel so smooth, and that's where the addictive part of Mortal Sin sets in. There's a certain flow you get into where you feel like an unstoppable force rampaging through enemies at a breakneck pace all the way down to the boss room. And this satisfying flow is what keeps you saying, just one more run until it's suddenly 4 in the morning. This flow of getting through each level is also aided by the fact that there's a literal arrow on the ground telling you where to go. It will either guide you to a button you haven't pressed yet, or the hole in the ground that takes you to the next floor. While some might say that the game is holding your hand too much with this feature, I didn't mind it at all, as it just made navigating each zone so much smoother, since combat and loot seems to be more of the focal point of the game anyway. You do need to be careful though, because even if you're being guided on where to go, you still need to keep your eyes open for traps and scares. Traps are no joke in Mortal Sin and have ended several of my runs early because, well, I'm a moron and I wasn't paying attention. They do some serious damage during the late stages of a run, and there were times where they sent me to the death screen faster than I could blink. Scares are similar to traps in that they deal massive damage if you're not paying attention, in addition to hitting players with a very cheesy jump scare. Graphically, Mortal Sin takes an interesting approach with grainy visuals mixed with vibrant colors. This serves as a way to color code enemies, loot, and traps so they stand out in contrast to the environment. It can be a little headache-inducing at times, but overall it's a stylistic choice that makes what could have been a typical fantasy-based dungeon crawler a little more unique and somehow makes the whole experience feel a little more demonic. If there's one thing that Mortal Sin nails, it's the melee-centric combat that feels incredibly visceral and satisfying to engage in. There's a multitude of different weapon types to choose from, and the game does a great job at making each one feel unique from one another. You have options like a pair of dual katanas that slice and dice through enemies with swift attacks, or a gigantic greatsword that lets you roleplay as Guts from Berserk and clang your way through hordes of demons. I'm not joking about roleplaying as Guts either, the greatsword is literally called the 100-Man Slayer. There's also this mini slow-mo effect that happens every time you hit an enemy that makes your attacks feel so much more weighty, which also contributes to just how good it feels to swing a weapon in this game. Defense is just as important as offense, and this is promoted through parrying attacks, especially the perfect parries you get for blocking an attack just before it's about to hit you. Perfect parries will grant you a strong follow-up attack, so players are encouraged to learn enemy attack patterns and time their blocks just right. You'll get humbled pretty quick if you're late into a run and are only focusing on offense, because enemies will delete you in only a few hits if you're not blocking or parrying. I know it's satisfying to just swing your weapon around wildly and dismember enemies, but don't forget that the best offense is a good defense, or some crap like that. Going back to offense though, Mortal Sin features a pretty intricate combo system, so there's more to attacking than just mindlessly left clicking. For example, following up a kick with a swing will have your character perform a lunging stab attack depending on what weapon you have equipped. Following up a bash with a swing will have you perform a power swing that deals more damage than a typical swing. Or, my personal favorite, you can perform a whirlwind attack by comboing a kick into a bash into a swing. With the right weapon, this attack can completely shred enemies in front of you, and it's a blast to pull off when you're surrounded by a large mob. Even beyond that, there's many more combos you can unlock through playing the game, so while the combat may seem quite simplistic when starting out, it will gradually throw more complexities your way, showing that the combat does actually have an incredibly high skill ceiling. Not to mention, there's also a damage multiplier system that rewards constant aggression. The more you attack, the higher the multiplier rises, up to an initial cap of 3, with the potential to go higher with the right upgrades. Even backing off for a few seconds will lose you your multiplier, so you need to constantly be in the fray, attacking and parrying attacks to utilize it to its fullest. This is just another feature that makes Mortal Sin's combat so complex, yet extremely satisfying to master. One final note about the combat that the game makes apparent right away is that you need to completely dismember enemies to actually kill them. This even includes their head. Beheading enemies will just have them run around kicking the air, and it's actually kind of silly to watch. There are some weapons that sort of ignore this and just make enemies explode, like some of the magical ones, but it's something you'll need to keep in mind if you want to be the most efficient Demon Slayer possible. As a game that's more roguelike than roguelite, there's not a ton of out-of-run progression for your characters like some sort of skill tree or permanent upgrades. You'll collect yellow essence during your runs that can be spent on additional potions or better equipment for the next run, but no permanent power-ups. The focus of Mortal Sin's progression is more on unlocking new weapons, armor types, or combos based on the order in which you complete each zone. You'll get new unlocks for completing levels in a zone for the first time, but you'll also get different unlocks based on which zone you pick second and third during your run. So if you started out with the dungeon for your first zone and picked the cave as your second zone, you'll get different rewards for completing levels in the cave as opposed to if you chose the forest as your second zone. And the same goes for whatever you pick for your third zone as well. I really like this system as it encourages players to mix up how they approach each playthrough, and it helps enhance replayability. And of course, you'll need to try every combination of zones if you're a completionist and you want to unlock absolutely everything available. Looking at the more RPG aspects of the game, there are several classes you'll choose from at the start of each run, in addition to some pretty standard stats. This includes health, attack, defense, speed, which affects movement and attack speed, and luck, which affects critical hit and drop rate. These stats will vary based on which starting class you pick, and more importantly, the gear you pick up during a run. Gear will absolutely litter the area at times like you're playing an action RPG, and you'll need to pick up what makes the most sense for your build. Gearing can sometimes be pretty overwhelming, but Mortal Sin actually does itself a favor by having simplistic stats. Due to the game's fast-paced nature, you'll likely be in the middle of the action as gear is dropping, so you'll need to make a quick decision if what's on the ground is an upgrade so you can pick it up and continue dismembering enemies. Other ways to enhance your character include power-ups that appear around every other level and can do things like increase your attack modifier, give you a heal on kill effect, or allow you to carry more potions. In addition to this, there's a risk versus reward system that appears twice in a zone where you can pick up a randomized buff to your stats for the rest of the run in exchange for enemies also getting a new buff themselves. This could include enemies exploding on death or dropping corrosive puddles of acid that'll eat away at the durability of your gear. It's completely optional to pick up, but it's a cool way to put an additional layer of challenge on a run to keep players on their toes if they want to give their character a boost. Lastly, I think Mortal Sin does a great job of making classes feel pretty distinct from one another. Each class will get a unique trait, starting stats, and some will only be able to loot specific types of weapons. The Berserker, for example, can only loot big swords like the previously mentioned 100 Manslayer, and has the Berserker Rage trait, which makes them immune during a whirlwind attack, promoting a true spin-to-win playstyle. Monk promotes a hilarious playstyle of throwing fast fists and roundhouse kicks to rack up the damage multiplier as fast as possible. Mage does mage things and decimates enemies from 50 feet away. Overall, there's tons of different playstyles here, and I had a blast trying out every single one. Mortal Sin features some of the most satisfying melee combat I've seen in a game to date, and if you're a fan of roguelikes and dungeon crawlers, you just might be missing out if you pass this one up. It's an early access title, but the developer does appear to be pretty dedicated to the game with a fairly consistent and frequent update schedule. All I know is the experience so far has got me hooked, and I'm excited to see what Mortal Sin has in store for us when it's fully released. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and let me know what you think in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support as I love making videos just like this. So please subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, thank you for watching.